Well, it's rare in this House to see legislation that puts the public interest ahead of vested interests, and this bill does that. It does put the interests of New Zealanders ahead of the vested interests of the tobacco industry, and so I think it's something of a red letter day to see this sort of thing, this rare piece of legislation in this House. I too would like to congratulate the Honourable Tariana Turia and the Maori Party and the inquiry that they have triggered into tobacco in the Maori Select Committee, but also Ian Lees-Galloway and his private members' bill, because I suspect that that Ian's bill and the fact that it was selected and was ready to be debated in this House has probably sped up the introduction of this piece of legislation into this House. Well, I was on the Health Select Committee 5 years ago when we considered a petition which recommended that the government require tobacco and cigarette displays in retail outlets to be out of sight. And Ian Lees-Galloway is absolutely correct that the National Party opposed this, and I've got the report here, and this is what the National Party said. It said, in the opinion of the national members, there is a need for more international evidence. Now, that's something we hear a lot about these days, like more international evidence about the link between alcohol and accidents, for example. Anyway, they said there needed to be more international evidence because at this time that banning tobacco displays would bring about a significant decrease in smoking in order to present a compelling and convincing case to the public. And that's what the National Party members argued in the Select Committee. They argued that there wasn't international evidence, despite the fact that a number of countries then had already introduced such legislation, getting tobacco and cigarette displays out of sight. Countries such as Iceland, Ireland, now we have the United Kingdom, but the National Party at that stage felt that there wasn't enough evidence. So it is great that 5 years later we finally see this legislation in this House. When we were considering this issue in the Select Committee, it was pointed out that there are 10,000 retail outlets which have these tobacco displays around New Zealand. 10,000. Every supermarket virtually in the land, well, I think every supermarket, every dairy and every petrol station, you go in there, you go to the checkout counter, and there is this huge display behind you. In fact, I was down at the Shell station the other day, and there was this, you walked up to the counter, and there was this huge display of cigarettes just behind the counter, and all around the rest of the shop was, or the petrol place was confectionery and chocolate and so forth. And I recalled that the New Zealand Superannuation Fund, and indeed Infratil, has taken over Shell, and I thought maybe they could indicate their commitment to New Zealand by taking a lead, getting rid of these cigarette displays before the legislation takes effect, and at the same time getting rid of the huge amount of confectionery that is there alongside cigarettes in every single Shell petrol station in the land. Anyway, we were presented with lots of international evidence that these, what they call power walls, these tobacco displays, they create the impression that cigarettes are just another harmless grocery product, just another consumer product. They legitimise them. They give a false impression of the safety of cigarettes, and they also, of course, are a constant temptation, particularly to anyone who's given up smoking. There they go into the supermarket, and there are the cigarettes, a constant temptation to them, but above all, a huge temptation for young New Zealanders, for children. Every time they go into a supermarket, there it is, there are the cigarettes, And it does have a very significant influence in tempting young people to take up smoking. So thank God that in this House tonight we are going to put the public interest ahead of the vested interest, and we are going to get rid of these so-called power walls, these tobacco displays. One of the interesting things we learned in that select committee is that the suppliers of cigarettes may, and in fact I think almost always, pay retailers to display their products. They wouldn't tell us how much, although we asked them in the select committee. It's a bit like Coke, which Coca-Cola pays retailers, schools, to have their vending machines, all over New Zealand. And so it is with the tobacco companies. They pay retailers to have these tobacco displays. And these commercial arrangements are the subject of confidentiality clauses. They're known as financial incentive arrangements. So no wonder that some of the small dairies and so forth are worried that they're going to lose income. Not only the main thing, of course, one of the main incomes they will lose is the money that they are paid to actually display these cigarettes in a tempting way right behind the checkout counter. Now, it's interesting when we talk about the lobbying of the tobacco industry. The latest issue of ASH points out that the Australian ABC has recently obtained internal emails, invoices and contracts that reveal that the tobacco companies in Australia had hired a public relations firm which had told them to launch a campaign hidden under a third party, like a retailers association, to run a campaign opposing plain packaging. And it pointed out that the New Zealand Retailers Group, the Association of Community Retailers, was also linked with the tobacco industry. So with this sort of relentless campaigning by the tobacco industry is still continuing to this day, and the tobacco industry is still putting up front organisations, third-party front organisations like the Association of Community Retailers to try to run campaigns opposing plain packaging. But the other interesting thing, it's not just that. We now have big tobacco trying to use the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and members will recall that this week we've been negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership in Auckland, and they're trying to use these trade negotiations to block anti-smoking laws in New Zealand. So what we have is the Philip Morris, one of the largest multinational tobacco companies, actually making a submission that it wants to use these trade agreements to try to stop governments from introducing anti-smoking measures such as the ones we are introducing tonight. Now, Philip Morris, extraordinarily, it is taking action against Uruguay's proposed anti-smoking laws under the investor dispute mechanism and one of these these free trade agreements in an agreement between Uruguay and Switzerland. Uruguay is proposing new measures to require graphic warnings on cigarette packaging, and the company, the Philip Morris, is arguing that these packages would expropriate their investments, and it is using a mechanism and requiring a World Bank panel to decide whether Uruguay should pay Philip Morris for this so-called expropriation. And Philip Morris is targeting our negotiations to require that it would be able to sue governments such as New Zealand, which attempted to introduce similar anti-smoking laws. So we have this astonishing situation where we are passing very enlightened legislation, progressive legislation in this Parliament tonight to try to reduce the amount of promotion of tobacco particularly to young children, and here we have the same tobacco companies still lobbying and using our so-called free trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, to argue that to introduce the sort of measures that we are talking about today, and particularly plain packaging of cigarettes, would be tantamount to expropriation of their property rights, and to require it would, in their submission, it would require us to submit
Order.
this to a disputes tribunal.